Millions of people from all over the world use camping as a temporary escape from their everyday lives, and they do this for the sole purpose of building memories with loved ones and family. But what happened to the people in today's story definitely built memories, but for all the wrong reasons. But before we get into their story, if you've had an encounter or know a story that you'd like to have shared here on the channel, please email me at the link below. If you like today's story, please gently slap that like button. And if you haven't done so already, especially if you're a return viewer, please hit that subscribe button. While you're at it, Chuck Norris roundhouse kick that notification bell so you don't miss out on any future content. Now, let's get into today's encounter. Today's encounter comes from three lifelong friends, John, Mark, and Chad, and it takes place in 2017 out of the Rocky Mountains of Alberta, Canada. These three guys were completely inseparable, and they were ever since they had met in kindergarten. They grew up in Edmonton, Alberta, which is just a very short drive to the Rocky Mountains out of Western Alberta. And these three guys, they shared very similar hobbies. Every spring and summer, they would spend it fishing and camping and hiking. Fall was dedicated strictly to hunting, and the wintertime there was basically hockey, snowboarding, and snowmobiling. Basically, whatever these guys would do, they did it together. No matter what they did, they were just completely inseparable, and they had a very strong bond, more like a brotherly bond than just a best friend type bond. Even once they were getting into their mid-20s and they started getting married, the three of them lucked out that their wives also built a very strong bond together as well. So it allowed the three families to spend a lot of time together. However, in 2017, it had been a couple of summers since the three guys had got any real guy time for an extended period of time. So they decided that they were going to go do what they loved to do all through their teen years and through their early 20s. And that was to go Crown land camping up in the Rocky Mountains of Western Alberta. If you don't know what Crown land is, it's government-owned land, which is public land, very similar to BLM land down in the States. And this was something that these three guys liked to do because it kept them far away from the busy campgrounds, far away from pretty much all the noise of all the tourist destinations up in the Rockies. So in mid-July, they loaded all their gear into the back of Mark's Silverado, they waved goodbye to their wives, and then they made the drive from Edmonton to Grande Cache, Alberta. In Grande Cache, they stopped, they fueled up, then they made their way south along the Smoky River to this little logging road that they had gone down a few times in their teen years and in their early 20s. They turned the truck onto this road and they started the hour and 15-minute drive to where they had planned to set up camp. As they made their way down this very narrow, very rocky, very rough logging road, the three of them were really starting to think, is this really a good idea? Yeah, we've done this road before, but we were young and stupid in those days. Like, this is not a good place for anything to happen. We have no cell reception. If something happens, we're pretty much screwed. But the three of them, they basically figured, you know what, we've been down here before. We're together. Anything happens, at least we're together and we'll get through it. So they continued down the road, and when they were about a half hour from where they had planned to set up camp, there was these three quadders stopped right in the middle of this road. Three younger guys, and they just would not move. They pulled the truck pretty much right up to them, honked at them, and these three guys just still would not move. They just turned, looked at them, and just basically continued talking. This especially infuriated Mark. He did not like when he was delayed because of somebody else's ignorance, so he started wailing on the horn, and these guys were not moving. So Mark opened his door, got out and started walking towards them to confront them to find out what the hell their problem was. And these guys turned, looked at him, and just started basically spazzing out on him. They were screaming at him, telling him to get back in his truck, basically yelling profanity at him the entire time. So the other two guys, noticing that these guys were showing aggression towards Mark, they got out of the truck as well. Once these three quadders realized that Mark was not alone, and he actually had two buddies with him that were also significantly older than them, their tone completely changed. They went from being very hostile, very aggressive, to being incredibly apologetic. They ended up starting their quads, they moved them over to the side of the road, and then Mark, John, and Chad got into the truck and continued making their way towards where they were going to set up camp. As they passed these three quads, Chad kept looking in the passenger side mirror of the truck just to make sure that these guys were not following them and that they were not going to be any trouble. And sure enough, he saw that those three quads were heading back the direction that they had just come. At this point, the three guys were like, you know what? These were just some young, dumb kids. We were young and dumb ones too. You know, I'm pretty sure this is exactly how we would have responded if we were out on our quads and some guys in a truck started honking at us. So they figured that they would just leave that be, and they continued making their way down that road for another half an hour. After 30 minutes, they saw this small clearing right on the right-hand side of the road. It was at the top of this ridge that looked down at the Smoky River. They slowly pulled the truck into this clearing, stopped, they got out, they grabbed as much gear as they can handle, and then they made a 10-minute hike down this ridge line to the base of the Smoky River. They actually ended up having to do 2 trips. They had to go from the truck down this slope to the river, come all the way back up, grab a second load of gear, and then make their way back down again. Once they had all their gear down on the shore of the river, they set up a camp, they got a fire going. It was already fairly late in the day, so as soon as the fire was going, they had some food, they had some beer. And at about 10:30 that night, they packed it in for the night, they climbed into their tents. The next morning, they woke up pretty much right at the crack of dawn. They made some coffee, they had some beans for breakfast. Then they basically spent the entire day fishing at various points along the shore of the Smoky River. That evening, they went back to camp. Again, they got a fire going, they had food, had a couple of beer. They did not drink more than just a few. They were in no way intoxicated. And that night, about 11 o'clock, again, they climbed into their tents and settled in for the night. That night, at around 1:30 in the morning, Mark was woken up because it sounded like somebody was walking around the camp. He could hear what was very clearly human footsteps going between the tents and going over towards where they had their fire and where they had all their gear laid out. Mark at this point was thinking that, maybe this was John, maybe it was Chad, maybe they woke up in the middle of the night, they had to relieve themselves in the woods, so he was not overly concerned. However, he started to hear whoever this was outside starting to rummage through the various packs and various tackle boxes that they had sitting over by the fire by their camp chairs. At this point, he was thinking, this is pretty odd. There's no way that John or Chad would be fiddling with stuff not this late at night and not that. They would be going through their personal packs, not through all the stuff we had outside. So he decided he was just going to call out just in case it was John or it was Chad. So he called out, he's like, hey, what's going on? And as soon as he yelled that, he heard whoever this was immediately stop going through things, but he could not hear them run away. He could not hear them walk back to the tent, and they said absolutely nothing. So at this point, Mark's like, okay, I got to go check this out because I really do not think that this is John or Chad. So he got up, got out of his sleeping bag, made his way to the front of the tent. He unzipped it, took his flashlight, shone it outside directly towards the fire. And just beyond where that fire pit that they had made was, he could see the silhouette of this person kind of walking all weird as if they were incredibly drunk, but walking into the bush. At this point, he yelled out, hey, as loud as he could, which immediately startled John and Chad awake. They quickly got up, they got out of the tent. The first thing they saw was Mark standing there holding his flashlight, looking into the woods. They came up to him, they asked him what was going on, and Mark told them that somebody had been going through all their stuff, and he saw them kind of stagger into the forest. So at this point, the three of them, they grabbed their knives. John and Chad grabbed a flashlight as well, and they ended up going into the woods, going to try to find whoever this was. They looked around the immediate area of their site for about 20 minutes. They found no sign of anybody. They did not see anybody. So they made their way back to camp, and then they started talking, trying to figure out who this could have been. And the only thing the three of them can agree on was whoever this was, it was most likely one of those kids on the quads that they encountered on their drive in. So they decided, you know what, let's just sleep in shifts tonight. If it was these guys and they come back, we'll just, we'll set them straight. Mark was completely riled up at this point, though, and he knew he would not be able to go back to sleep. So he told John and Chad, you know what, I'm just going to stay up the rest of the night. You guys go get some sleep. So John and Chad made their way back to their tents. Mark ended up making a small fire, and he sat by that for pretty much the entire night. Later on that night, though, while he was sitting by the fire, he felt himself slowly starting to doze off, and he was woken up by somebody calling his name from inside the woods, except they were calling Marcus. And he kind of woke up trying to figure out if he actually heard this or not, or if, maybe he just was in that state of being half awake, half asleep, and he just imagined it because the only person who ever called him Marcus wasn't his mom, it was his grandmother, and his grandmother passed away when he was 15 years old, and at this point of his life, he was 31, so his grandma had passed away 16 years prior. So he sat there for a minute just trying to process what just happened, because when he heard his name being called, it did sound a lot like his grandmother, but he was thinking, okay, yeah, I heard this. It did sound like my grandma, but my grandma's passed away. She has been for 16 years. I'm pretty sure this was just a dream. I was dozing off. I'm just completely freaking myself out now. I'm just going to try forgetting about it. And he just went on staring at the fire for about another 20 minutes. Again, about 20 minutes later, he slowly started to drift off to sleep when again he heard his grandmother's voice from in the woods calling Marcus again. And again, this time he quickly jolted back to reality, back to being awake, and was just staring into the woods in the direction where he had heard his name being called from. He ended up sitting like that, just not moving, almost frozen in fear, but absolutely confused because, again, he did not fully know if he actually heard this or if he just dreamt it, but it did seem incredibly real to him, and it just completely freaked him out. So he sat there just looking into the woods for about another 45 minutes till it started to get light outside, and his two buddies ended up waking up. Once John and Chad got out of their tents, they looked at Mark, who just looked absolutely wrecked. He looked super tired, and he just had this blank stare on his face, and he was just staring into the bush. They ended up walking up to him and saying, "Hey dude, is everything all right? You look horrible." And then Mark kind of snapped back to reality and looked at them and said, "Something really weird happened last night." He said, "Once you guys went to bed, I was sitting by the fire. I ended up dozing off." He's like, "Then I heard my grandma's voice from in the woods calling Marcus. And then I brushed that off like it was just a dream. And then about 20 minutes later, it happened again. But I can't be 100% if I actually heard this. But it's completely freaking me out. And I just don't know what to make of this." Both John and Chad at this point ended up saying to him, "You know what, man? You've been under a lot of stress lately. Last night you were really worked up. You were overtired. You just had a dream. Everything's fine. You know what? You just need to get some coffee in you, have some food, and just enjoy a day fishing, man, and everything will be fine." So they ended up making some coffee. They had some food. And then they went out fishing for the day again. Just like the day before, they fished various points along the river. That evening, they came back to camp a little bit earlier. Again, once they got back to camp, they made a fire, they had some food. That night, Mark did not have any beer. He was completely exhausted. So he ended up crawling into his tent before it was even full on dark out. That night, at around 2 o'clock in the morning, Mark was again woken up because he could hear his name being called from the woods again, but this time from the other side of the camp. At this point, he just yelled out to John and to Chad, who were immediately startled awake by Mark yelling. They came out of their tent. They went up to Mark's. Mark again told them, "Guys, I hear my name being called from in the woods." Again, they tried to tell him, "You know what, man? You're freaking yourself out. You just need to get to sleep. If it'll make you feel better, we'll build a fire. We'll stay up for a little bit, let you get to sleep, and then we'll call it a night again after that. So that's exactly what they did. Mark stayed in his tent. John and Chad made a fire. They sat up outside the fire. Mark eventually ended up falling asleep. John and Chad sat around the fire talking, when all of a sudden they heard Mark's name being called from in the woods. At this point, both of them just kind of looked at each other like, what in the F is going on? Their first thought went back to those quarters and the story that Mark had told them about that guy going through all their stuff. So Chad at this point yelled into the woods, "Get the F out of here and leave us alone." At this point, both John and Chad decided that they were going to stay up all night just in case these guys came back, because they were clearly messing with them at this point. So through the entire night, they kept the fire stoked, sat by the fire, listening for any sounds at all, any indication that these people were coming back. They did not hear any sounds like that, but they did notice through the night that the area all around the camp was completely silent. There were no bugs, no crickets, no sound at all. Once dawn came, Mark ended up waking up. He came out of the tent and saw both of his buddies sitting by the fire. The fire was still going, so he knew that they've been either up for a little bit or they did not go to sleep at all last night. So he walked up to them, asked them how it was going, and they ended up telling him that after he went back to bed, they ended up hearing a voice calling his name from in the woods as well. At this point, Mark was completely shaken up, because now he knew that he did not just imagine somebody calling his voice, because his two buddies heard it as well. And he knew that these two guys he was with were his best friends. They were like brothers to him, and they would not mess with him like that. So it really shook him up, and he ended up saying to them, "You know, guys, there's something really weird going on. Like, I'm not feeling safe here. Like, maybe we should pack up. Maybe we should go somewhere else." Both John and Chad were very convinced at this point that this was just those quarters, but they could tell that Mark was very shooken up by it. So they ended up saying, "You know what, man, that's fine. We'll have some food. We'll pack up. We'll go somewhere else, and the rest of our trip will be completely fine. We'll just get away from this area and everything will be good." So they had some food, they collapsed down their camp, grabbed their first load of gear, and then they had to make their way up that ridge to where their truck was parked. Once they got to the truck, they dropped their gear off and they started making their way back down to camp for their second trip. Once they were about 100 yards away from the camp, they were on this little bit of a ridge that overlooked directly above their camp. It was only 100 yards away, but it was a significant elevation above it, so they had a very clear view of their camp from that ridge. And they noticed that there was somebody in their camp going through the stuff that they had left behind. They could see various items kind of scattered all around their campsite. At this point, the three of them were completely enraged, and they just started running down the slope towards camp. When they got right to the perimeter of camp, they saw this person hunched over, digging through one of the packs, and they just started screaming at this guy going through all their stuff. As soon as they started yelling, this guy stood up, turned, and he started running into the bush, but he was running really weird. He was like he was staggering, kind of swaying side to side as he was running through the trees. The three of them kind of looked at each other for a second and then proceeded to chase this guy into the woods. As they were running through the woods, they were only about 45 yards behind him, but they could just not catch up to him. It was like every time they would get a little bit closer, this guy would pick up pace and pull away from them. They chased him for a few minutes, for a few hundred yards through the woods, when up ahead of them they could see an opening in the trees that opened up into a bit of a meadow along the shore of the river, and they saw this guy go through the trees into this meadow, and a few seconds later they broke the tree line as well, and they could see that this meadow was actually a fair size. It was about 200 yards long, It was about 150 yards wide with the river on one side and a steep slope on the other. And there was absolutely no sign of this guy. They could not see him. The grass was not long. It's like this guy just completely disappeared in front of them. The three of them kind of just stopped and just looked out into this meadow, trying to figure out what happened to this guy and where he went. When all of a sudden they noticed about 45 yards from them, there was this deer, this buck, that was looking directly at them. The three of them, their focus kind of turned to this deer, and this deer started walking towards them. Now, the three of them, being lifelong hunters, knew that that was not typical deer behavior, and this deer should have taken off when they broke the bush line. In fact, it probably should have taken off well before they broke the bush line, because they were yelling at this guy as they were chasing him. So they were looking at this deer, and the three of them were just basically all thinking the same thing, like, what the hell is wrong with this deer? Why is it coming towards us? After a few seconds, this deer went from about 45 yards down to about 20, and then it just completely stopped, and it was staring right at them. The three of them just stood there looking at this thing, and John ended up saying, "Guys, look at that deer's eyes." So the three of them ended up looking at the eyes of this deer, and they noticed that this deer, the eyes were not on the side of its head. They were on the front of its head, forward facing, just like a predator. The three of them instantly knew that this deer is something's up with it. It's not normal. So they took a couple steps back, and as they were stepping back, this deer in front of them all of a sudden stood up on its back legs, which deer will sometimes do if they're grabbing leaves or grabbing food off a branch of a tree or hitting a licking branch. But this deer was in the middle of a meadow, and it started taking steps towards them on its hind legs. The three of them instantly, pure panic mode set in. They turned around and started running back in the direction of camp, the entire time just completely freaking out, just basically yelling, "What the hell is that?" and telling each other to run faster. When they got to the camp, they completely abandoned the stuff that they had left behind from their first trip. They ended up scrambling up that ridge back to the truck. They got in, and they ended up taking off out of there. They did not end up going and setting up camp anywhere else. Once they were back in the city, they ended up talking about it, and the only thing that they could really come up with was what they encountered out on this trip was a skinwalker or some other form of shape-shifting entity. Well, that's it for today's encounter. As always, guys, please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. The fact that these entities could take the form of a deer is incredibly freaky to me, because as you could tell, I am a deer hunter, and it is the start of archery season up here in Manitoba. So every time I'm going into my blind or to my stand, I know I'm going to have this stuck in my head, especially if a deer starts staring at me like one did last night. That's probably going to end up playing games in my head a little bit. But as always, thanks for joining us, and if you haven't done so already, please hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you next time.